Well, good day and welcome to lesson 40 in our study of the book of Mark. Today we're starting chapter 10, the first 10 verses. Jesus by now had left the area of Galilee, and as it says here, he rose from there and came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan. This was in the territory controlled by Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. And as usual, as was the custom, when Jesus was around, people came and gathered around him. People came to him for both healing and for teaching. And as it says, multitudes gathered to him again, and as he was accustomed, he taught them again. And as also was the case, the Pharisees were there. The Pharisees were there to goad him, to try to trap him, to try to trick him, and to try to make him stumble in his teaching and in the law. And it says this, the Pharisees came and asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Testing him. This was not a by-the-way question. This was a very carefully calculated query. And he answered them. Jesus answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." The Pharisees didn't really answer the question, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "What did Moses permit you to do?" Now, there's a background to all of this which is important. So I'll try to summarize it briefly. First of all, they were in the area ruled by Herod Antipas. And this was the king who took his brother's wife to be his own wife, Herodias. And it was through Herodias' daughter's dancing that Herod actually made a pledge that he would give Herodias whatever she wanted. And because John the Baptist was so much against Herod's marriage to Herodias that she wanted John the Baptist's head, and this led to John the Baptist being beheaded and killed for his beliefs. But this was the area because John the Baptist would not give his blessing or commend Herod Antipas to marry his brother's wife, having divorced his own or in addition to his own. So this was the background and the area in which this question was raised. If you go back earlier in the Bible, it had become very common for people to divorce, men to divorce their wives or vice versa, and it became very common for people, Jewish people, to marry other women outside of the Jewish race. And this is really shown in Nehemiah in chapter 13 because there's a whole series, a whole area where God curses and shows that this is not right. Solomon was guilty of this because he had, in addition to his own wife, many wives of different cultures. And David also had many wives. But this was not in keeping with God's plan. So in both Nehemiah chapter 13 and in Malachi chapter 2, it says very clearly that this was not in keeping with what God wanted. And in Malachi chapter 2, it says very clearly, but he was talking about the priest misleading people, leading people astray, making them do things which was against God's wish. And it says even in verse 16, the Lord of Israel says he hates divorce, for it covers one's garment with violence. So the prophets had spoken against divorce long before Christ was giving this talk here. But it has still become very commonplace. And it became so much so that there were actually two trains of thought about divorce in those days. One was by a Rabbi Shammai, who sort of taught that divorce was not right unless it was on the grounds of sexual immorality and uncleanness. This was one train of thought, and some people went along with that. But the more prevalent train of thought was that promoted by Rabbi Hillier, who said that uncleanness was any kind of discretion. So anything that a woman did could lead to her being divorced by her husband. And this became to the point where at Jesus' time, a woman could be divorced by her husband for burning the supper, or by dressing differently, or by, as I said, showing too much ankle, or by just not doing what he wanted her to do. And this was sometimes the way that the divorces were made in those days. And it was in the priestly class as well as in the common people. There was also a Rabbi Osibi who said that a man could divorce his wife if another woman just seemed to please him more. So it had become far removed from the idea of a divorce being based on sexual immorality only. And this was the context in which this question was asked: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Matthew puts it down: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus said, what did Moses command you? Now Moses had permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. And Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. In other words, because men were so stubborn, because people were so hardened towards each other, they had developed such animosity at times between each other, that Moses wrote down this precept. So that a man could easily divorce a woman for almost any reason. And this almost makes love an idolatrous type of affair, because if a person sees someone else they think they like or love more, they can just divorce the first one. And that was really not God's intent at all when he wrote the Bible, or when he wrote down his word. And it says here very clearly, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. He made male and female from the beginning of time. And he did this for this reason: a man shall leave his father and mother, and he be joined to his wife. This is the basis of a godly marriage. A man and a woman are joined together. A man leaves his parents. A woman leaves her parents. They are joined together to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. And when that one flesh has a child, that is evidence of that one flesh, because the child is one, made from two. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. This was entirely different from the teaching that was being taught by the scribes, by the Pharisees in the temples, because it was taught pretty well universally that a man could divorce his wife for almost any reason. And it is still that way in some religions today. But that was not God's intent. Marriage is an institution instituted by God, not by man, although man now has the authority to make it so-called official. So this was Jesus' teaching and reply, that mankind, a marriage, was an institution started by God, in which two people were joined together to become one flesh, and therefore could reduce one flesh from the two of them. And this has not changed. Now, was there an exception to this? Yes, there is an exception to this. The exception was, put down in 1 Corinthians, that there was a case of abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. So if a person in a marriage between a believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse, and one leaves, that is a reason, a potential reason for a divorce, a true divorce. The other is if there is sexual impropriety, a sexual problem in the family, sexual immorality. That is the only apparent reasons given in the Bible for divorce. Marriage should be between three persons: husband and wife and Christ. Those three, because the marriage of husband and wife corresponds eventually to the marriage of the church and Christ. It is all laid out in this manner. So the Pharisees gave this test to Christ, to Jesus, because of the situation, the culture in which they were in. The culture which implied that anybody, any male could divorce his wife for almost any reason under the sun. That women were merely property, and that they could be easily put aside and substituted for someone else, even, as one rabbi said, even if the man just decided that. So Jesus was saying, no, marriage is something instituted by God, and it was to be between a man and a woman for life. And that difficulties that arose would be dealt with, or should be dealt with, by taking them to God and having Jesus and God as part of the whole relationship. And he said, and in the house, when they left, the people who were there, were with them at the time, his disciples asked him again about the same matter. They still did not understand it. So when they were by themselves, they again asked the same matter. So he said to them, Jesus said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. If there's a marriage which has been broken apart for reasons other than sexual immorality, or a mixed marriage, shall we say, a believer and non-believer, then actually there's a degree of adultery involved in it. If a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So marriage is something which God takes very seriously. Now you can ask what constitutes, in truth, a marriage. Is it the feelings of one that one has for another, or is it the paper that sometimes is put together by secular organizations, secular systems, to say that a marriage has taken place? Or is it in the heart of the people that really makes a difference? But that's another subject altogether. Jesus is saying very clearly that God has instituted marriage, and between a man and a wife, and it should be forever. It should be permanent. That no man put asunder. What God has joined together, let not man separate. This question was raised because of the culture of the times in which this was written, a culture which is very similar to the culture of today. Divorces are very common, and they're very often done for very trivial matters. So this is the idea of this little passage in chapter 10. The Pharisees asked this question in an effort to trap Jesus. He came back quoting Genesis and quoting the real purpose of marriage from the beginning of the Bible. We're going to get on to rest and further on in chapter 10 next week, but that's all for today. So thanks for watching, and bye for now.